I didn't know why I had come back. Maybe I had something to prove to myself. Maybe I just wanted to feel closer to him again. It had been a year since my husband, Mark, passed away. The silence of the house had been suffocating, and the weight of his absence made every day heavier. I thought going on a camping trip, just like we used to, would bring me some kind of peace, a way to feel like he was still with me, even if only in memory. Mark and I had spent so many weekends out in the wilderness, setting up our tent near quiet lakes, hiking through thick forests, sitting by the fire as the night closed in around us. He had always been the one who knew how to handle things. He was the one who built the fire, who knew what tracks belonged to what animal, who could hear a sound in the distance and tell if it was something to worry about or not. Without him, I felt like I was just pretending. I picked a place we had camped before, deep in the woods, a few miles from the nearest road. It was a place he had loved. I packed the gear myself, drove out there myself, carried the heavy backpack down the trail myself. The weight of it pressed into my shoulders, reminding me how much I had taken for granted when he was here. The first day passed quietly. I set up my tent near the same clearing where we had camped before, next to a small, still pond. I gathered some wood, lit a fire, and sat there as the sun sank below the trees. It was peaceful, but when night came, I started to feel it. The unease, the way the darkness pressed in, the way every sound seemed louder when there was no one else around. I wasn't used to being alone in a place like this. I told myself I was imagining things, that the sounds in the woods had always been there. I had just never noticed them as much because I had Mark beside me. I forced myself to sleep, though it was restless. The second day was harder. I hiked for a few hours, trying to lose myself in the quiet. The trees stretched high above, the ground soft with pine needles. The air smelled fresh, clean. But every so often, I had the feeling that something was off. It started as little things. A twig snapping behind me when I wasn't walking. A rustling sound that stopped the second I held my breath to listen. The feeling of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal, maybe even just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the day stretched on, it got worse. I came back to my campsite in the late afternoon and found something that made my stomach drop. The firewood I had collected earlier was scattered. Not like something had knocked it over. It was spread out like someone had kicked through it. I stood there, staring at it, my heart pounding. A bear, I thought. Maybe. But bears don't just mess with firewood for no reason. And there were no tracks, no claw marks. It looked deliberate. I didn't want to let fear take over. I cleaned up the mess, rebuilt the fire, and tried to go about my night as if nothing was wrong. But as the sun set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone out there. That night was worse than the first. I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, but every few minutes I heard something. Footsteps? Maybe, or just my paranoia. But I was sure I could hear something moving. Slow, careful. Not an animal crashing through the brush. Something or someone trying not to be heard. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was nothing, I heard it. Something brushing against the side of my tent. Not wind, not a branch. Something deliberate. My entire body went cold. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just listened, heart hammering in my chest. The sound moved, slow, circling the tent. I reached for the knife I had brought with me, gripping it tight, my fingers shaking. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The sound was gone, but I didn't sleep. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped the tent and looked outside, my stomach in knots. The campsite looked wrong. There were footprints, bare footprints, too large to be mine, too small to be Mark's if he had been here. They circled the tent. Someone had been out there, watching me. I should have packed up. I should have left. But I told myself it was nothing. that it was probably just a hunter passing through, that maybe I had imagined the sounds. I stayed. The third night was worse. I didn't bother trying to sleep. I sat up, knife in my hand, listening, and I heard it again. The slow, deliberate footsteps, but this time there was something else. Breathing, close, just outside the tent. I felt frozen, every instinct in my body screaming to run, but I couldn't. If I moved, whoever was out there would know I was awake. Then a shadow against the thin fabric of the tent. Tall, motionless. I held my breath. The shadow stayed, just standing there, watching. I gripped the knife so tight my hand ached. My body screamed to do something. Run, scream, fight. But I couldn't. Then, after what felt like forever, the shadow moved. Slowly. It backed away, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep. When the sun rose, I packed everything in minutes. I didn't eat, didn't even bother putting the fire out properly. I just shoved everything in my pack and started walking. Fast. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this, I will never go camping alone again. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly through the quiet countryside. I was heading to an old farm that belonged to a friend of mine. Well, not really a friend, more like an acquaintance. His name was Mark, and I had met him through a few mutual connections. He owned a big piece of land, mostly fields and some patches of woods, and he told me once that I was welcome to camp there if I ever wanted a quiet place to be alone for a while. I had no real reason to go, other than just wanting to be away from everything for a bit. I had been feeling restless lately, sick of the same routines, the same places, the same people. The idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, just me, my truck, and a tent, sounded like exactly what I needed. I reached the farm late in the afternoon. The place was old, the kind of farm you'd expect to see in a forgotten town. There was a big barn, faded red paint peeling from the wooden boards, and a farmhouse that looked like it hadn't been lived in for a while. Mark had mentioned he didn't really stay there much anymore. Said it was more of a family property than anything. He still owned it, but he lived in the city now, and the farm was just sitting there, empty. I parked my truck near the barn and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was heavy with the smell of earth, grass, and something faintly musty, like damp wood. The fields stretched out in every direction, tall grass swaying slightly in the breeze. A line of trees bordered the property on one side, dark and thick, almost like a wall. I grabbed my gear from the truck and started walking toward a small clearing near the edge of the woods. I figured it would be a good spot, far enough from the barn and house that I wouldn't feel like I was camping right next to abandoned buildings, but still close enough that I could use the barn for cover if the weather turned bad. Setting up camp was easy. I pitched my tent, set up my little fire pit, and pulled out a folding chair. The place was quiet. No cars, no voices, no city sounds. Just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of grass in the wind. I sat for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. As the sun set, I started a fire and made myself some food. Simple stuff, just a can of beans and some jerky. The night air was cooling down and the fire felt good. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flames, letting my mind drift. Then I heard something. It was faint, barely there, but enough to make me sit up a little straighter. It sounded like footsteps, not close, not right next to me, but somewhere out in the field. A soft, shuffling sound, like someone walking through the grass. I turned my head slowly, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing, just the empty fields, stretching out under the dim glow of the moon. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just an animal, A deer, maybe, or a coyote. Something moving through the grass, minding its own business. I forced myself to relax, leaning back in my chair again. But I kept my ears open. The night wore on. The fire crackled. The wind blew. And I let myself get lost in the quiet. Then, a few hours later, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. Closer this time. A slow, deliberate crunch of grass. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring out into the darkness beyond the fire. Then, another step, and another. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. I reached for the flashlight next to my chair and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the field. The bright light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the tall grass, shifting slightly in the wind. I held it there for a few seconds, scanning, waiting. Nothing. After a moment, I turned the flashlight off, and that's when I heard it. A sound I still can't explain. A long, slow exhale. Not mine. Not the wind. Something else. It was close. Too close. I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. I turned the flashlight back on, whipping it around in the direction of the sound. Nothing. I stood up slowly, my body tense, every sense on high alert. I knew what my brain was telling me. Someone was out there, watching me, moving when I wasn't looking. I felt exposed, standing there in the open. My tent was useless. A thin piece of fabric wasn't going to protect me from anything. I needed to make a decision. Staying out there was no longer an option. I grabbed my keys from the chair, keeping the flashlight pointed into the darkness as I backed toward my truck. Every step felt like it took forever, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes darting to every shadow. The truck was only about 50 feet away, but it felt like a mile. I reached the door, yanked it open, and climbed inside, slamming it shut and locking it. For a long time, I just sat there, breathing hard, staring out into the night. My flashlight was still on, resting on the dashboard, its beam pointing toward the field. And then I saw it, just for a second, a shape barely visible at the edge of the light. A figure, standing, watching. My chest tightened, my fingers gripping the steering wheel. And then it was gone, just like that. I didn't waste another second. I started the truck, threw it into gear, and floored it. The tires spun for a half second on the dirt before catching, and then I was moving, speeding away from that place as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, the farm nothing but a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I never went back. I never told Mark what happened. And to this day, I still don't know who or what was out there that night. But I know one thing for sure. I was not alone. I had always liked being out in nature, away from the noise of the world. Camping alone wasn't something new to me, but this time, I wanted to push myself. A full week, deep in the woods with no one around. I picked a spot in a national forest, somewhere far from any trails. I wanted solitude, just me and the rain, because the forecast showed nothing but storms for the whole week. I arrived early in the morning, parked my truck on a dirt road, and hiked in with everything I needed: tent, food, water, extra clothes, a knife, an axe, and my rifle. I didn't expect trouble, but being alone in the woods, you had to be prepared. The air smelled like wet earth, the kind of scent that sticks to your skin when rain is coming. The trees were tall, stretching high into the sky, their branches thick with leaves that made everything darker underneath. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of wind through the canopy. After about an hour of hiking, I found a good spot, a flat area near a small creek. The trees around it were dense enough to break the wind, but not so thick that I'd feel trapped. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire before the rain came. By late afternoon, the first drops started to fall. At first, it was light, tapping against the tent and leaves. But as the sun sank, it became heavier, turning the dirt into mud and making the creek swell. The fire struggled, but I had built a small cover for it using branches and a tarp. I sat under my own tarp, listening to the rain, eating a simple meal, and just enjoying the quiet. That first night was peaceful. The rain was constant, but I was dry in my tent. I fell asleep quickly, wrapped in my sleeping bag, the sound of raindrops lulling me into rest. I woke up to gray skies and more rain. The air was colder, and my fire was struggling. I added more wood, careful not to use too much since finding dry pieces was going to be difficult. I ate breakfast, then went out to explore. The forest felt different in the rain, darker, heavier, almost like it was pressing down on me. The trees dripped water constantly, and the ground was thick with mud. I followed the creek for a while, keeping an eye out for anything interesting, tracks, fallen trees, maybe a good fishing spot. That's when I noticed something strange. A set of footprints, deep in the mud, heading in the opposite direction. They weren't mine. They were fresh. I stopped, looked around, listened. Nothing. The rain made it impossible to hear anything else. The footprints weren't from boots. They were from someone barefoot. That made no sense. No one else should be out here, especially not walking around barefoot in the rain. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. The thought of someone else being out here unsettled me, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunter got caught in the rain and lost his shoes, or maybe they were old, washed up by the rain. Still, I went back to camp, kept my fire going, and stayed close to my rifle. I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made me jump. The rain had gotten heavier overnight, turning the creek into a loud, rushing stream. The air smelled different too, earthy, but something else mixed in. Something off. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to do normal things, cut wood, check the area, try to enjoy being alone. But I kept thinking about those footprints. In the afternoon, I decided to look around again, this time with my rifle slung over my shoulder. I found something worse than footprints. Half a mile from my campsite, a dead deer was lying in the mud. But it wasn't just dead. It was torn apart. Its stomach was open, guts spilling out, like something had killed it and left it there. The meat was still fresh. It hadn't been dead for long. I checked for tracks. Nothing. No boot prints, no paw prints, nothing but disturbed mud. The rain had washed away whatever evidence was left. The thought of a predator being nearby wasn't what scared me. What scared me was that whatever had killed this deer hadn't eaten it. It was just left there. I hurried back to camp, my skin crawling. That night, I barely slept again. The rain was relentless, pounding against the tent, drowning out every other sound. But at some point, in the middle of the night, I heard something. Footsteps, not far from my tent. Slow, deliberate, moving through the mud. I stayed completely still, listening. Then silence. For what felt like an hour, I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. But nothing came. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, but when I woke up, I felt like I hadn't rested at all. The rain wasn't letting up. My firewood was soaked. Everything smelled damp. I needed to get out of there. I packed up my things, ready to head back to my truck. Then I saw it. Another set of footprints. This time they were right outside my tent. Whoever or whatever had been out there last night had been inches from where I slept. The footprints were deep, pressed into the mud, leading away into the trees. Barefoot. Again. I didn't follow them this time. I didn't want to know. I grabbed my pack, shouldered my rifle, and started moving. The hike back felt longer than before, every step heavy with the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rain soaked through my clothes, Mud clung to my boots, and every gust of wind made me whip around, expecting to see something behind me. But I never saw anyone. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove straight home. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time it rained, I felt like I was back in those woods, listening to something move outside my tent. I don't camp alone anymore, not after that week. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, but I know one thing: I wasn't alone. It had been a long time since I last camped with anyone, let alone my sir and his old retired sergeant. It wasn't something I ever planned, but when Sir asked if I was up for a trip to the woods, I didn't think much about it. He said his retired sergeant, a man named Philip, had been talking about getting out into the wilderness for a while. Said it might be his last real trip before age fully caught up with him. I didn't know Philip well. I had heard stories about him, how he was one of the toughest men Sir had worked under, a man who had seen things most people wouldn't believe. He had served his time, fought his fights, and then retired to a quiet life, but men like him didn't just sit still. When Sir told me Philip wanted one last good camping trip, I knew I couldn't turn it down. We packed light, enough food for 3 nights, rifles for hunting, knives for safety. Philip had an old tent, something he had used for decades. Sir and I had our own gear, newer, better suited for rough conditions. The plan was simple: drive out to the edge of a national forest, hike deep enough to be away from the rest of the world, set up camp, and enjoy the kind of peace that only comes from being miles away from civilization. The first day was uneventful. We hiked for hours, cutting through thick brush, moving past trees that towered over us. The deeper we got, the quieter it became. At first, that was the best part. No cars, no buzzing electronics, no distant hum of the world moving too fast. Just the sound of leaves crunching under our boots, the occasional bird overhead, and the wind pushing through the trees. But as we moved deeper, something about the silence changed. I didn't notice it right away, but there was something unnatural about it. The birds stopped singing. The wind didn't feel like it was moving as much. Even the usual rustling of small animals seemed to fade. Philip noticed it first. He was an old man, but his instincts were sharp. He kept scanning the trees, eyes narrowed. Sir picked up on it too. There were no words exchanged, but I could tell from the way they moved, slower, more cautious, that they sensed it. I started to feel it too, that heavy, almost suffocating weight that settles in your chest when you know something isn't right. We weren't alone out there. By the time we set up camp, the sun was already sinking. We had found a good clearing near a river, flat ground, plenty of space to set up our tents, and water close by. It should have been perfect, but even as we got the fire going, the air felt heavy. Not cold, just thick, like the woods were watching us. We ate in silence, listening to the crackling fire. Philip sat with his rifle on his lap, his back straight despite his age. Sir kept glancing over his shoulder every now and then, scanning the dark spaces between the trees. We turned in for the night early. The plan was to wake up before sunrise and do some hunting. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric walls, listening. The woods weren't as quiet as before, but the sounds were strange. Heavy footsteps, somewhere too far to pinpoint but close enough to hear. Snapping twigs, the kind that break under real weight, not just from small animals. I wasn't the only one awake. I could hear Philip shifting inside his tent, slow, controlled movements like he was reaching for his gun. Sir was still as a rock in his own tent, waiting. None of us spoke. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A low, dragging sound. Not footsteps, not wind, something else. something moving through the brush with a weight that didn't feel right. Philip sat up first. I heard his rifle click. Sir followed a second later, zipping open his tent just enough to peek outside. I didn't move. I didn't want to. I just lay there, breath slow, heart pounding, listening. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The woods went silent again. Not a single leaf moved. I don't know how long we stayed like that, waiting, but eventually, the exhaustion won. I fell asleep. By sunrise, the night before felt almost like a bad dream. Almost. When I stepped outside my tent, Sir and Philip were already up, their eyes scanning the ground around our camp. Something had been there. The dirt around the campfire had been disturbed. Deep tracks, too large for a person, too heavy for an animal, sank into the soft ground. They weren't boot prints. They weren't paw prints. They were long, almost stretched, like something had been dragging itself forward. Philip crouched next to them, his jaw tight. Sir didn't say anything, but his face was set in a way that told me he was thinking hard. We should have left right then, but we didn't. We told ourselves it could have been a bear, maybe even a wounded one. We told ourselves we had weapons, we were experienced, we could handle it. So we stayed. The day passed without trouble. We hunted, we cooked, we acted like nothing was wrong. But there was something wrong. Philip, for all his years, looked more alert than ever. His eyes constantly flickered to the trees, his hands never far from his gun. Sir was the same. I felt it too, that unshakable feeling of being watched. By nightfall, the tension was thick. We took turns keeping watch. Philip volunteered first. Sir took second. I was last. By the time it was my turn, the fire had burned low. The night was dark, thicker than before. I sat there, gripping my rifle, forcing myself to stay alert. And then, just past the edge of the firelight, I saw it. A shape, not fully visible, just the suggestion of something long, too thin, almost blending into the trees. It was watching. I gripped my gun tighter. Then, without a sound, it moved. Not walking, not running, just shifting, almost like a shadow stretching itself further. I blinked, and it was gone. I woke the others. Philip didn't question me. Sir didn't either. We packed up and left. It wasn't a normal hike back. We moved fast, barely speaking, constantly checking over our shoulders. The woods felt different in the daylight. The silence had weight. The air was thick. And then, just when I thought we might make it out without seeing anything else, a noise, far back, deeper in the trees. Not footsteps, not an animal, just that same dragging sound. Philip looked at Sir. Sir looked at me. We didn't stop. We didn't turn back. We just kept walking. And we didn't look behind us. Not until we were back at the truck. Only then did Philip let out a slow breath, his fingers white-knuckled around his rifle. Sir didn't say anything. Neither did I. Some things don't need to be talked about. Some things are better left in the woods. And whatever was out there, we weren't meant to see it. I've always liked being out in the wild. Started when I was young, going on weekend trips with my dad. He taught me how to set up a tent, track animals, and respect the land. Over the years, I kept up the habit, turning it into a solo thing. Being alone out there, away from all the noise, felt right. This happened a few years ago. It was late autumn, the kind of season where the days are crisp, but the nights hit hard with a deep cold that bites through layers of clothing. I had taken a week off work and drove up to a remote forest in Montana, a place I had been to once before. It was isolated, miles away from any town, and perfect for what I wanted. Some peace, some distance from everything. I packed enough food and supplies for several days, my rifle for protection, and all the gear I needed. The plan was simple. hike deep into the forest, find a good spot near the river, and stay put for a few days. I wanted to hunt a little, fish a little, and just exist out there. The drive out was long. The farther I got, the less paved road there was, until eventually, I was on nothing but dirt and gravel. I didn't see another car for hours. By the time I reached the old trailhead, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows between the trees. I parked, got my backpack on, and locked the truck. The air was cold, filled with the smell of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the ground and the occasional distant call of a bird. I hiked for several miles, following a path that wasn't really a path, just an old game trail winding through the trees. After a couple of hours, I found the spot. It was perfect, right near a small river with a clearing just big enough for my tent and fire. There were no signs of other campers, no litter, no disturbances, just untouched wilderness. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in for the night. I cooked some food, watched the flames dance, and listened to the river. Everything felt normal. But then, as the last bit of daylight faded, something shifted. The forest, which had been filled with distant sounds of birds and rustling leaves, went completely silent. It wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. No wind. No insects. No night sounds. Just stillness. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just one of those nights where everything goes still for no reason. I sat by the fire a little longer, watching the darkness settle in around me, and eventually, I crawled into my tent. At some point in the night, I woke up, not to a sound, but to the absence of one. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow against the tent fabric. Then I heard it, a single, slow footstep, not an animal, not the light, scurrying movement of a raccoon or the deliberate weight of a deer. This was a step, like a person walking barefoot on the cold earth. I stayed still, barely breathing. My rifle was within reach, but I didn't move for it yet. Then another step, closer. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. I knew how to tell the difference between animals and people. This wasn't an animal. I reached for my rifle, slow and careful, trying not to make a sound. Then, just outside the tent, I heard breathing. Not heavy, not panting, just a slow, steady inhale and exhale, like someone standing there, just beyond the thin fabric, watching. I gripped the rifle tight, my heart pounding. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. I wanted to move, to do something, but fear kept me frozen. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, listening, but there was nothing, just that awful, complete silence. Eventually, after what had to be at least an hour, I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal, something weird but harmless. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. Birds were chirping. The wind was moving through the trees. I forced myself to believe it had been nothing. I checked around my tent. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. I went about my day as planned. I hiked a little, fished in the river, even managed to bring down a small deer. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that I had just been paranoid. But as night fell, the feeling came back. That wrong silence, that unnatural stillness in the air. I kept my rifle close, my fire bigger than the night before. I stayed up late, staring into the trees, waiting. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, standing just beyond the glow, there was a figure. It was shaped like a man, tall and thin, but there was something off about it. The way it stood, the way it held itself, it wasn't right. I didn't move. I didn't blink. It stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch its face. It looked like a person, but the skin was wrong, stretched too tight, pale and dry. The eyes were too large, dark, empty. It opened its mouth slightly, and the movement was jerky, unnatural. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite right, it said my name. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. The fire crackled, casting flickering light over its face. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire burning, watching the darkness, waiting. By the next morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed up fast, not stopping to eat, barely thinking. But as I started back toward the trailhead, the woods felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. Every sound made me jump. Then, a few miles in, I found something that stopped me cold. My own footprints, leading back to my campsite. But I hadn't come this way before. Something had walked in my exact steps, backward, leading me in circles. I ran. I didn't stop until I saw my truck. I threw my gear in, started the engine, and tore down that dirt road without looking back. Only when I was miles away, back on paved road, did I let myself breathe. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. I still camp, I still hunt, but not alone, never alone. Because out there in the deep, empty wild, there's something else. Something that can watch, something that can listen, and something that can walk in your footsteps. I had always liked camping alone. It gave me time to think, to clear my head from the noise of everyday life. I wasn't someone who needed much. A tent, a small fire, a good sleeping bag, and I was set. I had done it so many times that I didn't think twice about heading out on my own. I knew how to stay safe, how to keep animals away, how to read the weather. I wasn't an expert, but I was comfortable. This time, I chose a spot deeper in the woods than usual. I had taken time off work, and I wanted to be somewhere remote, away from everything. I found a location through an old hiking forum. People had talked about it years ago, saying it was a great hidden gem. No official trails led there anymore, which meant it would be quiet. It took me a few hours to hike in. The trail was overgrown, but that was part of the appeal. I had my pack, my gear, and a GPS, so I wasn't worried. By late afternoon, I found a good clearing near a small stream. The area was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and a good distance from any major paths. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the air cooled. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of an animal. I sat by the fire for a while, staring at the flames, listening to the night take over. Then, I noticed something, a sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps, not an animal, too steady, too careful. Person. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond that, it was just darkness. I listened, waiting, but the sound had stopped. Maybe I imagined it. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling stayed. I wasn't alone. I was sure of it. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. Slowly, I scanned the tree-line, looking for movement. The trees stood still, unbroken. I even called out, not asking if someone was there, but more as a warning. A way to say, asterisk, I hear you. I know you're there. Asterisk, nothing. I stood there for a long time, waiting, but no one came out. No movement, no more sounds. Just silence. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had been a small animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. I had been out here alone all day. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. I sat back down by the fire and stayed up a little longer before heading into my tent. I slept lightly. Every small sound outside pulled me halfway back to consciousness. The wind in the trees, a branch cracking, the stream bubbling nearby. I woke up several times, checking my surroundings through the thin fabric of the tent. Each time I saw nothing. Then, sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up to something different. A noise, not footsteps this time, breathing, slow, steady, right outside my tent. I froze. The fire had burned low, leaving the campsite in near darkness. The only light was the dim glow of embers. I strained my ears, trying to figure out exactly where the sound was coming from. It was close, just outside. I stayed completely still. My knife was in my pack, just out of reach. My flashlight was closer, but turning it on might give away that I was awake. I listened, heart pounding. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. Silence. For a long time, I didn't move. I just lay there waiting, but nothing happened. No footsteps walking away, no rustling in the bushes. It was like whoever or whatever had been there was still standing outside, completely still. Minutes passed, then an hour. I barely breathed. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, the first hint of dawn. I forced myself to move, slowly unzipping the tent and peeking out. No one. Nothing seemed disturbed. The fire was dead, my gear untouched. The only tracks were my own. But something felt off. I packed up quickly. I wasn't sticking around to figure out what had been out there. As soon as my pack was secured, I started hiking back. I moved fast, barely stopping to catch my breath. Every so often, I stopped and listened, making sure I wasn't being followed. About an hour into the hike, I saw something. A boot print, fresh, deep in the dirt. Not mine. Someone had been out there with me, watching. I kept moving, pushing forward without stopping. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my pack inside and locked the doors. It wasn't until I was miles away that I let myself breathe again. I never went back to that spot. I never even tried to find out who else had been there. Some things I decided were better left unknown. I always liked to camp alone, not because I didn't enjoy company, but because there was something about being out in the wild, away from the noise of people, that made me feel at peace. I had been doing solo trips for years, never had a problem. I was careful, always prepared, and knew my limits. This trip was no different. At least that's what I thought. It was early fall somewhere in northern Montana. The trees were starting to turn, the air was getting crisp, and the mosquitoes were finally gone. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, miles away from any town, just how I liked it. There was a river nearby for water, plenty of wood for a fire, and a clearing just big enough for my tent. I parked my truck a couple of miles back on an old dirt road, locked it up, and hiked in with my gear. I liked to camp where no one else did, places that weren't on the maps. I had found this spot years ago and had come back to it a few times since. There were no marked trails, no campsites, just the trees, the river, and the quiet. I spent the first day setting up camp. I built a fire pit, cleared out any rocks under my tent, and gathered enough firewood to last the night. The sun dipped below the tree line early, and by the time darkness set in, I had a solid fire going. I cooked some food, sat back, and listened to the sounds of the woods. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, branches shifting, the river moving, the distant hoot of an owl. I didn't feel uneasy, not yet. That changed around midnight. I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard something move outside. Not the wind, not a small animal. This was something bigger. I sat up, listening. Crunch. It was slow, deliberate, not like a deer or an elk moving through the brush. Those animals don't stop and start like that. Crunch. It was closer now, maybe 20 feet from my tent. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. Not yet. I just sat there, waiting, listening. Silence. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound over the crackling of my fire, which had burned down to a few glowing embers. Nothing. I waited a long time before I finally convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a porcupine. It didn't matter. I let out a breath, lay back down, and eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed off. No broken branches, no tracks that I could see. I figured I had just spooked myself. I spent most of the day fishing in the river, caught a couple of trout, cooked them over the fire. It was peaceful, just how I wanted it to be. But as the sun started to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was that same sensation you get when someone's watching you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept looking over my shoulder, even though I knew I was alone. At least I thought I was. That night, it happened again. I was in my tent, half asleep, when the sound came back. Crunch. This time, it was closer. Crunch. I sat up fast, gripping my flashlight. My heart was hammering in my chest. I clicked the light on and pointed it at the walls of my tent. But of course, that didn't help. I needed to see outside. I unzipped the door just an inch and shined my light out. Nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Then, just as I was about to lie back down, I heard something else. Breathing. It was slow, deep, and close, right outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping my knife now instead of the flashlight. I waited, but the breathing didn't stop. It wasn't an animal. No bear breathes like that.
No elk. No moose.
I swallowed hard, then yanked the tent door open all the way and shined my light out. Nothing. But the moment the beam hit the trees, I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the light. Not moving, not saying a word, just standing there. It was tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't move. It didn't move. Then, after what felt like forever, it just stepped backward, disappearing into the trees. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, waiting for the sun. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up my gear. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just shoved everything into my pack and started hiking back to my truck. I walked fast, kept my head on a swivel. The whole time, I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone was just behind me, just out of sight. When I finally made it to my truck, I nearly collapsed with relief. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I noticed something in the dirt, just outside my window. Footprints. Not boot prints. Not shoes. Bare feet. They led from the trees right up to my truck, and then right back into the woods. I didn't wait to think about it. I turned the key, threw the truck into gear, and got the hell out of there. I haven't been back since, and I never will.